Followed, an original post-apocalyptic story read by the author. This story follows after the events of the A Survivor's Daily Routine trilogy, and it is highly recommended you listen to those first. They can be found in the playlist linked in the description, along with all the other stories set within the same universe. Adam Wachowski awoke and sat up in his bed, groaning in pain. His shoulder was still sore, but had begun to heal nicely over the few days that had passed since he'd been attacked by the hillbillies. He tried to move it and his arm, as little as he had to, though. As Adam sat up, he realized that he had slept in due to the light creeping in from the hallway through the open bedroom door. The bedroom he and Kailani shared had no windows, so he knew for it to be that well illuminated that it must have been late in the morning. Specifically, 3 days had passed since the ambush on the road, and Adam was well on the mend. The knife wound to the shoulder had, amazingly, not been very deep, mostly just bloody instead of serious, but it still hurt. Adam had spent the days doing what small jobs he could around the property with only one arm of true use. He checked his game cameras, unaware that as he did there were unfriendly eyes on him, and set up a new fishing net in a nearby stream. He also helped Kailani in the gardens, collected jugs of water from a spring that flowed out of a cave in a hillside a few miles from the house, and studied some books he had recently brought back about not only how to make your own bows and arrows, but how to make your own bullets as well. If the family wanted their 4 guns to be of long-term use, then they couldn't rely on the few boxes of ammunition left at the drugstore for the rest of their lives. Adam would likely have to build a makeshift blacksmith in the future where they could make fresh bullets. Thankfully, there was an old pile of bricks just inside of the forest that he could finally make use out of for such a project. But that wouldn't be anytime soon. Most of Adam's jobs in his immediate future were still small things, helpful in their own ways, but often still finding ways to hurt his arm and shoulder and render it unusable for a few hours nonetheless. At least the arm he used to drink coffee with wasn't the one out of commission. Kailani was already gone from the room when Adam sat up on the bed, so Adam climbed out of bed as well and left the room too. Once in the hallway, he saw Maeve's bedroom door was open and it sounded like she was inside. Katrina was sitting in the living room, and Adam didn't see Nolan anywhere, and assumed he was somewhere outside. Entering the kitchen, the room with the most light coming in from the windows, partially thanks to the sliding glass door, Adam looked outside and saw Kailani near the garden plots. Then looking up at the sun, he feared it was around 10 in the morning, meaning he hadn't slept for as late as he'd initially thought he had. In fact, it was still rather early, the whole day more or less still ahead. Opening the door, Adam stepped out onto the back porch and stopped on the bottom step. "Morning," he called, leaning against the support beam for the porch. Kailani looked up and waved. "Keeping out the weeds," she said, holding up a handful of uprooted greenery and then standing up a moment later. Adam nodded, rubbing his shoulder. "Hey, how about a family fun day today?" he asked. The idea had come to him suddenly while he was in the kitchen, after seeing that it was still early. But it was a perfect chance for a day to go by without him needing to use his shoulder for anything. Plus, it had been too long since they'd had one. "A fun day?" Kailani asked. "Yeah, family time. A day to just relax, forget our hardships, and not be wound up." "It's been a while," Adam replied. Kailani kept staring at him for a few seconds, and then she smiled. Adam did too. He loved the quiet life, and times when everything wasn't wound up tightly were rare occurrences. Today would be a treat for all, time to just wind down, rest, and most importantly, it would be time to spend together as a family. Maybe it would also help bury the tension that had built up between them as well. Maeve and Katrina giggled as they splashed each other with water from the pond. Despite the fall season being in full swing, and the weather having cooled off substantially for well over the last week, the water was still plenty warm enough from the summer months for swimming. That particular day, the weather had also taken a dramatic, yet welcome, uptick in temperature, and it almost felt like summer again outside. And so there they were, laughing and splashing as they swam in the deepest part of the pond, enjoying what might very well have been the final warm day before the weather got cold and stayed cold until spring. As soon as the girls had heard a fun day was happening, they had both rushed to get their swimsuits on. They never missed an opportunity for swimming. Kailani sat nearby on the anchored pontoon boat. After pushing it offshore and paddling out to the deepest point of the pond and throwing the anchor off the bow, her daughters had wasted no further time before jumping in for the first time since the last few weeks of summer. They were the only ones on the boat. The boys had other plans for their day. Adam, wearing his vest as usual, stepped out of the cabin. Nolan was sitting on the end of the dock, waiting for his father to join him, fishing rod already in hand. Nolan wasn't the biggest fan of swimming, so he and Adam had decided they'd rather spend the fun day fishing off the dock. Nolan had set two foldable chairs up on the end of the dock while his father had brought down the fishing gear. Maybe the girls would even scare the fish towards them with all the splashing and laughing they were doing. Nolan couldn't help but think to himself how constant the laughing and splashing had been for the last several minutes. Had his sisters even stopped to breathe? Unaware of their brother's musings, the sisters kept laughing and splashing each other, playing in the water as kids having fun did. Maeve took a deep breath and dove down, staying just under the surface where the light was still bright. Looking down, she saw just how quickly the water grew murky. Something certainly seemed to have stirred up the bottom recently. Maeve wasn't worried about it, though. Her father had done a check to make sure no unwanted animals had entered the pond, like he always did before they swam. She swam back to the surface and took a breath of air just as her sister splashed her again. "Oh, you little!" Maeve giggled, splashing her sister back, starting a full-on water war. Screaming, splashing, and kicking, neither of them noticed the shape gliding through the murky water below them. Briefly visible for just a moment, Version 2 swam just slightly deeper than the girl's kicking legs, vanishing into the murk again, less than a second after the twinkling golden light illuminated his face, teeth, and claws. If you had been looking down at the pond at that moment from a bird's-eye view, you might have seen the large shape swimming under the drifting pontoon boat, on which the mother of the swimming girls was reading a book, fully unaware of the shape circling her two laughing and splashing daughters in the murky depths. Then the shape dived and was gone. Maeve and Katrina continued splashing each other and swimming, just as unaware of what had passed under their kicking legs as their mother was of what had passed under the boat. Unaware of what could have suddenly dragged them down under the water if it had so wished to do so at the time. Unaware of what was gliding at the bottom of the pond, completely hidden from their sight. On the dock, Nolan reeled in his fishing line and casted it out into the water once again as his father approached. Nolan sat back down in his chair, hearing the steps of boots on wood behind him as his father approached him. "Any luck?" his dad asked, stopping and baiting the hook on his own line. "Not so much as a nibble," Nolan replied. "Ah, well, there'll be days like that," Adam said, dropping his bait while trying to attach it to the hook. "Little rusty there, father?" Nolan joked. Adam shook his head. "It just slipped. Injured arm. And I haven't gotten to fish for fun for a good while," he replied, bending down and picking the bait up off the dock. "So, you are rusty," Nolan said, smirking as he turned to face the pond again. "You don't think that they're scaring the fish into not biting at all, do you?" he asked. Adam shrugged. "Well, if they are, not much we can do about it. I'm not going to tell them to stop having fun just so we can hook a few fish. Besides, son, catching fish isn't everything. I'll be content to just spend the day tossing lines and chewing the fat with you." Nolan chuckled. "Okay. You're right, Dad. Catching fish isn't everything." "That's my boy," Adam chuckled, tossing his own line into the water and sitting down in his own chair. Catching fish sure is fun, though, even if the ones in this pond don't taste great, Nolan said after a second. Adam laughed. Well, you are not gonna if you keep running your jaw like that, he said, looking out at the water. Maeve waved at him, pausing mid-water war, and Adam waved back. It did a father good to see his kids having fun. Letting them just be kids was a rare treat for him to give them in such a harsh world. Christmas might as well have come several months early. Katrina and Maeve kept splashing and giggling, not looking down into the water. Though now, there was no sign of anything swimming underneath them, nor was there any signs from above of anything swimming under the boat. Nolan cast out his line again, still not getting so much as a single tug on the end. He sighed. Normally the fish in the pond swarmed a baited hook. Why were they not biting today? He hadn't so much as seen a single tail flipping under the water. Surely his sisters weren't causing that much chaos to the pond's underwater inhabitants. Katrina lunged at her sister and shoved her under the water. Maeve came up a second later, sputtering. "Oh, you've done it now!" she shouted as she spat water out of her mouth and began swimming after her elder sister. Nolan cast out his line into the water again, staring at the spot where the ripples originated from. The water went still around it, and his line remained unattractive to the fish. The pond seemed unusually still to him. He'd never seen his line not get so much as a nibble before. Maeve caught up to her sister and kicked herself forward, grabbing Katrina by the back of her shoulders and shoving her under the water with a massive splash. Some of it even reached the deck of the pontoon boat where Kailani was still reading, and getting a slight tan in the process. The day was going as well as any summer afternoon did. In fact, it was about as perfect of a day as any of them could have asked for, in fact. Adam reeled his line in and set his pole down on the dock. He then stood, stretched, and told Nolan he was thirsty and going up to the cabin for a drink. "Want some water?" Adam asked. "No thanks, Dad," Nolan replied. "It's fresh from the spring," Adam said. "I'm okay, Dad, thanks," Nolan insisted. Adam nodded, ruffled his son's hair, and walked down the dock, saying to himself something about needing to get even more water from the nearby spring soon because of how tasty and fresh it was. "Wasn't getting low in stock," Nolan shrugged. Then he remembered his dad had just filled up a few jugs at the spring the day before. "No, he must be an addict," he chuckled, staring at his line in the water. Again, the water had gone still around it. It then suddenly took off, being dragged into the pond by something, obviously something large and moving fast. Adam heard. He had just reached the end of the short dock when it happened, and he turned and hurried back as Nolan clambered to his feet. Nolan looked startled. He'd never seen a line being pulled so quickly, and he didn't make any move to react for a moment. "Lock the line! Bring it in, son!" Adam shouted as Nolan stood up, knocking his chair into the water accidentally as he did. "Shit!" Nolan said when he heard his chair fall in the water, though he decided to focus on his fishing line. As soon as Nolan locked the line, however, the fishing pole was yanked out of his hand by the strength of the thing pulling it, and it flew into the water with a splash. Adam stopped. Nolan stood frozen to his spot, wide-eyed. Nolan stared at the bubbles in the water, then at his hands, and then he turned to gaze up at his father, who also looked simply bewildered. A second later, the water, a short distance from the end of the dock, exploded with a splash, and Nolan's fishing pole flew out of the water, landing between father and son on the dock, bitten into two pieces right in the middle. Adam and Nolan stared at it in bewilderment, and Adam crouched down to examine the pole after standing frozen in shock for a few seconds. "What could..." Nolan trailed off. "Dad, what could do that?" Adam picked up the pole and examined it. "It must be something in the water. Some big fish." But we fished everything out that was dangerous," Nolan protested. Adam nodded. "I know, but we must have missed one Some large fish, another risottus maybe. Could have been a baby that we missed when we fished out the adults. He paused as realization hit him, and stood up quickly. Oh shit, he said, dropping the broken pole and running off the dock, Nolan following. They ran around the pond, closer to where the boat was, and Adam began waving and shouted, "Out of the water! Kailani, get the girls out!" Kailani stood up, and the girls stopped splashing. "What is it?" Kailani called. "Girls, swim calmly back to the boat. There's something in the pond. Out!" Adam shouted. Katrina and Maeve did as instructed, both staying remarkably calm, and their mother helped them out and onto the boat. "Come on, paddle in," Adam called. He then looked at Nolan. "Fun day's over. We're going to have to discuss this." He then looked back at the pontoon boat. "Until I say otherwise, no swimming!" "Dad, how could we have missed a risottus, even a baby one?" Nolan asked. Adam shook his head. "I don't know, Nolan. The pond gets really deep over there. I guess I can see how one might have stayed out of sight after all this time, as unlikely as that is. If there is another one in there, then we're lucky that it hasn't done anything until now." "That's probably where all your fish went, though, right down its gullet," he said, watching Kailani and the girls as they began to paddle the boat toward shore. When the boat got close to shore, Adam took a few steps into the water and helped them pull the boat up onto the bank. As the girls jumped off, he hugged them both and motioned them to the cabin. "Head on up to the house, get dried off and changed out of your swimming clothes," he said, sending them on their way as he helped Kailani climb off the boat. "Go with them. I'm sure they're a bit shaken. We'll talk about this at dinner tonight." "What's in the water?" Kailani asked. Adam shook his head. "I don't know. My guess is we missed one risottus, or something similar." "How?" Kailani asked after a moment. Adam shrugged, shaking his head and replying, "I don't know. I thought we got them all out of there years ago. And if we missed one, I feel like we would have noticed it by now." Are you sure it's not something else? Something that wandered in?" "I guess that's possible, but I feel it's unlikely. Before the girls got in, I walked around the pond just to check and make sure nothing slipped in, and there were no footprints leading into the water. So, as improbable as it sounds, I feel like it has to be a large fish that we missed," Adam said, truly at a loss. Kailani sighed, rubbing her arms. I just don't see how we could have. We checked so many times to make sure," she said. Version 2 swam up into the shallow water under the dock as he sent the fishing rod flying out of the water. Staying hidden under the dock, sitting between the wooden support beams, Version 2 lifted his head out of the murky water, watching the family and listening to them. His gaze focused on the father, the man who tried to kill him. He snarled softly. As much as he wanted to rush out and kill the man, he remained hidden and waited until the moment would be perfect. Version 2 watched them, as a group, as they all headed up to the house, his gaze remaining unblinking the entire time, and his head slowly turning to follow them. The dad, Adam, would be his first victim. The others he would pick off after, in whatever order he desired. And until that moment came, not a second would pass where he wouldn't be watching them from somewhere. Once the table had been cleared after supper that evening, the Wachowski family stayed seated, recalling the alarming events from hours earlier. They were having a family meeting to discuss the events. "It's times like these I wish we had a guard dog, something that could warn us about unwanted visitors," Kailani said, looking down at the floor as she spoke. Maeve looked down at that comment too, looking like she wanted to say something, but ultimately didn't. She wanted more than ever to tell her family about her raptor friends. She didn't. She was still too worried about how her father would react to learning about Streak, Bard, and Gamma to bring them up. She was also worried that her father might even go as far as to blame them for what was happening if she told him about them then. Kailani then looked back up at the table. "What are you going to do?" she then asked. Adam sighed. "Well, we don't even really know what's in the water, but the only thing I can think it could be is a risotto we missed somehow. I'm gonna have to catch it and shoot it like the others." "You're sure it's a risotto?" Kailani asked. "Well, no. Even though that's what I think, I've also thought about other possibilities. Obviously, there's something in the water. Something potentially dangerous. I know a few aquatic predators I've seen around here before that it could be. It could be a chasmatasuchus, or a large vanaclevia, maybe, or potentially anything else, in all honesty. From the Devonian to the Cretaceous and anywhere before, between, and after, and beyond, which we have or haven't seen. Honestly, with how many possibilities it could be, trying to guess without seeing it at all is about as effective as throwing darts at a board and trying to hit one specific point. We can't leave it there, though. Whatever it is not only a threat, but it could also be the reason that we didn't catch any fish today, which means our food stock is being affected," Adam said. "What about a nothosaurus? We had one of those in there before," Kailani suggested, but Adam shook his head. "No, those aren't particularly dangerous to people. The most they'll do is nip at you, then go away. Besides, one of those couldn't bite a fishing rod in half like that. And again, I didn't see footprints, and I even went back and checked again before supper, which makes me think it's not something semi-aquatic. It could still be anything, but I really think it's some big fish we missed because of the lack of footprints. Either way, we're going to have to catch it. I've got some volumes about prehistoric aquatic and semi-aquatic predators I'm going to go through later tonight that might give me a better idea of what we're dealing with exactly. They cover all eras of Earth's prehistory, so hopefully I'll find something to give us an idea. Be it a fish, crocodile, aquatic reptile, anything that sounds even remotely like it's in the right ballpark." "Can I help you catch it, Dad?" Nolan asked. "Me too," Katrina added. Adam looked at his children and then shook his head. "No, we don't know what's in the water, so I'm not putting anyone else potentially at risk. Besides, we only have one fishing rod now." "You have that really big hook in the garage the old ATV is in. Why not stick a rope on it and use that instead?" Katrina said. "And use what for bait?" Kailani asked. "There's still pork from that wild pig I shot a while ago in storage. Guess I can use that. What we have left is just a big chunk of it, so getting it on that large of a hook wouldn't be an issue," Adam replied. "Go out on the boat with my rifle, throw the baited hook and rope in the water, then wait." "Dad, can I help you get it all set up, please?" Katrina asked. Adam shook his head. "No, Nolan will help me set—" "Why? Let me help you for once!" "Watch your tone," Adam replied. Katrina stood up and stormed away from the table. She stopped just long enough to say to her mother, "He does love Nolan more," she spat, storming off to her room and slamming the door. Adam sighed. "That's not true," he said, rubbing his eyes. "Nolan just has actual experience with this kind of thing. I don't want anyone else with me on the boat. But I need someone if we use that idea. I can't both pull the rope up and shoot whatever's in the water." Kailani placed her hand on his arm. "Then let her help you this time." "Yeah, Dad. I can help Mom tomorrow. Katrina can handle it," Nolan agreed. Adam sighed, and Kailani slightly tightened her grip on his arm. "Adam, listen. You need to let her help you tomorrow. I know you mean well, and that she's still too young in your view, but always having Nolan help you has really hurt her more than you realize." Adam nodded after a second. All right, he relented. Though, I might still have some use for you, son. We probably shouldn't bet it all on one line of bait, he added, standing and leaving the room. He entered the hall and knocked on Katrina's door. Katrina, he called. Go away! Her muffled voice shouted back. It sounded like she had buried her head into her pillow. Adam sighed. Don't you want to help me out tomorrow still? He asked. There was a silence in Katrina's bedroom for a moment. Then she opened the door. Really? Adam smiled slightly and crouched down in front of her. Really, he said. She smiled and threw herself into his arms, causing Adam to chuckle. Thank you, she squealed as she hugged her father tightly. Adam gave her a good squeeze and then scooted her back to look her in the eyes. I don't love Nolan more than you, he assured. I love you all the same. Always. I'm sorry if I made you feel any different. I'm sorry if my always asking Nolan for help made you feel hurt. He's older than you. And I just wanted to make sure he was ready for anything before I began working with you. You're just so young still, and I guess I kind of forgot you're not as young as you seem to be, he said. Katrina smiled and hugged her father again. After everyone had gone to bed, Adam took a lantern out into the living room and sat it on the small table by the couch, going to his bookshelf and pulling the volumes of books about aquatic animals from the shelves. It had been years since he'd gone through some of these, and some he never even had. He began skimming through, looking at the drawn depictions of various prehistoric aquatic animals. He paused at one point while looking at a drawing of the Adestus. The particular species wasn't identified, but its serrated teeth and the way that they were arranged within its mouth, a single row in the midline of the upper and lower parts of its mouth, looked oddly familiar. He'd seen those teeth and the unique structure in which they were arranged somewhere else other than that drawing before, but he couldn't remember where. Aside from looking familiar, the shark-like animal's teeth had caught his eye because they would have been positioned in such a way to bite the fishing rod in half in the specific manner it had been. Adam could clearly picture the scissor-like teeth slamming down on the rod in the way that would have split it like it had been. But Adestus was a genus of fish species that lived in the Carboniferous era ocean, not in small freshwater ponds. There was definitely not one of those in the pond. Nowadays, they'd be swimming out in the oceans, which were all far away. Yet, Adam couldn't place why its teeth and how they were structured looked so familiar. He'd seen them somewhere else once. He knew it. How they were arranged in the mouth was a dead giveaway. But were there other animals from the natural order of things that had teeth arranged like that? Even if there was, what were the odds that he'd have encountered it himself? Adam shook the feeling off, knowing that Adestus couldn't be his culprit. If he limited himself to the familiarity its teeth caused, then his clue would turn into a red herring. Especially since his book implied that Adestus was the only genus of curved teeth arranged in that specific way. He continued scanning through the pages long into the night, looking at animals that ranged from Rhizodus to Sarcosuchus, a crocodile so big that it ate dinosaurs, to the shockingly large arthropod Jaeclelopterus, to even semi-aquatic dinosaurs like Baryonyx and Suchomimus. He gave every possibility a chance, no matter how unlikely they appeared to be at first glance. Yet nothing seemed to be his culprit, though. Other nightmarish animals, horrors from across many ancient eons, which he saw depictions and reconstructions of, as well as guesses on how they worked when alive, ranged from familiar looking to completely alien. There was only a drawing of the Tychodus, while there were pages and pages about the Xiphactinus, Ednopteron, and many others, but all of them had features that disqualified them as potential answers. One of the major factors was that most of the fish he read about were ocean-dwelling fish, not freshwater fish. Even the Risottus, a freshwater fish, was not a perfect fit, even though Adam still saw it as his most likely suspect, since there had been some in the pond before. Adam also made sure to take note of various large prehistoric amphibians he saw, powerful carnivores from their own bygone age who could have been hiding in the water. There was a seemingly endless supply of nightmarish creatures with nightmarish teeth, animals that man was never meant to interact with. Animals that looked alien when compared to the animals of the modern day. And prehistoric fish and amphibians were not the only suspects. The carnivorous mammal Ambulocetus, an ancestor of modern whales from the early Eocene, was also suspect and perhaps even a candidate Adam saw as more likely than others. Yet, like everything else, it also didn't match perfectly with the situation. One thing that caused Adam to pause every time he came across what might have been a fully waterborne culprit was the fact that Adam could never reasonably explain how one would have gotten into the pond and remained unnoticed. No amphibians or mammals came as close as some fish species did to being the culprit, but there was no reasonable explanation for how they got into the pond. Risottus he could explain through one individual not being caught, or even one hatching from an egg after the others were fished out, but missing one when he knew deep down the pond was emptied of them just wasn't a satisfying enough answer for Adam. Nothing fit. By the time Adam found he had closed all of the books he had on aquatic prehistoric animals, he found that he was no closer to answers to what was possibly in the pond. All he had learned was that the things in the prehistoric waters were, in some ways, far more terrifying than the things that lived on the prehistoric land. He had no idea what to expect from the animal in the pond now, which made whatever was in the murky water even more frightening. He only knew that it was probably something very undesirable from the land, or rather the waters, of prehistoric horrors. For all he knew, it was a species lost to the fossil record and unknown to humans altogether. The fear of the unknown had taken a firm root in Adam's brain, and his mind continued racing for several long hours, deep into the night. Adam started early the next morning, Katrina at his side. They pushed the pontoon boat off the bank and into the water before the sky had completely turned from morning gray to blue and climbed aboard, paddling out into the deepest point of the water, their paddles causing the only ripples on the pond's still surface. The weather had cooled considerably from the day before. Both father and daughter were wearing warm clothes and insulated rubber boots. Adam also wore a white shirt under his red vest, and Katrina had a thick purple sweatshirt on. As she helped paddle, Katrina looked down into the water but saw no signs of anything below. "We're about there. The anchor is tied to the bow. Get ready to throw it over when I say," Adam instructed. Katrina nodded, set her paddle down, and ran to the front of the boat, lifting the anchor off the carpeted deck. "All right, go ahead," Adam said, sticking his paddle into the water with another splash. Katrina threw the anchor off the bow, and it made a far bigger splash. She watched it through the ripples and bubbles as it sank out of sight into the shadowy, dark gray pond water. The anchor quickly vanished. The rope trailing behind it was the only sign of it that remained, and the end of it too was lost to sight in the depths. It, the water, seemed much more ominous now than it had the day before. At his father's instruction, who had ultimately decided it would be better to have more than one bait source placed in the water to hopefully speed up the process of catching whatever was in it, or at least help entice it to show itself, Nolan was going around the bank of the pond, casting a baited line into the water close to shore. He was keeping distance between himself and the water at his father's instruction, as a means to mitigate the risk. Adam felt that if Nolan stayed on shore, with a distance between himself and the water at all times, he would be fine and relatively safe from whatever was in the pond. In an effort to help entice something to bite the hook like it had the day before, Nolan was using the same bait as he had used during the incident, hoping it would cause a similar reaction. Adam had not wanted to put anyone else at risk, but Nolan assured his father he was up for the job when asked, and it was then that Adam had told Nolan to keep some distance from the water while casting his line. He had only just cast out his line for the third time when he heard the splash of the anchor being dropped into the water. Like his father and sister, Nolan was wearing insulated rubber boots, and he had a thick, zipped-up, dark gray jacket on. Watch it not even be a fish. Probably was some giant amphibian or something. Maybe a Prianosuchus, that'd be cool to see at least, he muttered, reeling in and casting out his line again. Either way, surely we're bound to catch something, he said. He then glanced around, as if it just hit him. I'm talking to myself, he mused. Though he continued to cast out, there was not a single tug or nibble on the line. Even as he kept moving around the edge of the pond, the line remained as still as the water's surface. Once the sun was higher up in the sky, and the water less disturbed, Adam slid his cooler up to the front of the boat and opened it. He pulled out a cold, ham-sized chunk of pork and set it on the deck. Got the rope tied to the bow nice and tight? He asked, grabbing the large hook he had retrieved from the old garage. Katrina nodded. It's one of my double knots. We might never get it back off, she proudly said. Adam nodded, chuckling slightly. Good, he said, swinging down and sinking the hook into the meat. He stood up and, after making sure that the meat was stuck to the hook firmly, and making sure the hook was secured to the rope nice and tightly, he chucked the bait over the front of the bow. The pork made a splash not nearly as big as the anchor had, and Adam and Katrina watched it sink out of sight into the depths. Okay, keep an eye on the rope. Let me know if something tugs on it. I'm going to get my gun loaded, he said, patting Katrina on the shoulder and walking back towards the stern, where his rifle was sitting on one of the seats at the back of the boat. Katrina sat down and leaned over the front of the boat, looking down into the water for any sign of movement under her reflection. Back inside the cabin, Kailani was revealing to Maeve what her chores for the day would be. I'm going to work in the garden plots, Kailani said, putting her straw hat on. I want you to clean your room, she said to Maeve. Maeve groaned. Can't I help you with the weeds? Child, I've been asking you to clean that room for 2 months. Get it done before I come in for lunch, she replied, in that tone mothers use when they signal the conversation is over. Maeve sighed. Yes, Mom, she said. Good. You have the largest bedroom, so take care of it or we'll give it to someone who will, Kailani replied, kissing her daughter's forehead and walking out of the back door. Maeve just stood there for a second. Clean my room, she grumbled. I can clean it later, she added, talking to herself unawares just like her brother often did. She went to her room, locked the door, grabbed her jacket, and climbed out of the window. No one is none the wiser, she said, knowing that would be true as long as she got back before lunchtime. Making sure she wasn't seen, Maeve took off at a run towards the forest. Adam opened a box of bullets and began sliding them into the .22 rifle. After about a minute, he loaded it with the maximum number of bullets it could hold, and he made sure it was ready to fire. Gun now loaded, Adam set it back down against the wheel helm and walked back towards the bow. Anything? He asked. Katrina looked up from the water and shook her head. No, nothing, she said, turning away in time to miss the barely visible movement of something that had been watching her in the depths swim back into the deeper water. Adam nodded and sighed, sitting down on one of the plastic deck chairs. Well, Nothing to do but wait. Katrina sighed too, and stood up as well. Yeah, she said, taking the seat opposite her father. Hey, Dad, what's the weirdest animal you've ever seen out here, other than that dinosaur you shot the other day? She asked after a few seconds of silence. Adam replied, placing his hand on his chin while he thought it over. The weirdest? I suppose maybe the second notosaurus I saw once at the lake. No, not that one. I'd say maybe. No. I'd say definitely the Shringosaurus I saw grazing with a herd of cows in a field once. I had to find that one's name in one of the books I have. I'm happy it was in one of them because it was so weird looking that if it wasn't, I'd probably have kept bringing home more books until I found one that had what I wanted to know in it. I tell you this too. One of the most intimidating I've ever seen wasn't even one of the big dinosaurs. It was an Intricatherium. Maybe one of the reasons I found it so intimidating was because it was a mammal, like us, and not something so different from us like a dinosaur. So what was the scariest animal? Katrina asked next, expecting him to say Tyrannosaurus, Spinosaurus, or maybe Giganotosaurus, or any of the other big carnivorous dinosaur species. People, Adam quietly replied without any hesitation, looking down. Huh? Katrina asked, looking confused. Adam sighed, looking back up at her. You know, the reason I've been hesitant to let you go out with me on my outings isn't because of the dangerous animals. It's because there are a lot of bad people running around out there. I found that out very early into this whole life. Like I've said to you before, you're so young that I didn't want you to have to see how the world really is yet. I get it. I never let you come help me. It's always your brother. But it's not because I don't love you or don't think that you can't handle it. It's because the world is ugly and dangerous. And I wanted you to not have to see how it really is out there until you're older. I should have just told you, but I didn't, and I'm sorry. But that's the truth. And I only ever take Nolan with me away from home whenever I'm sure I won't see anybody else. People are really the scariest? Katrina asked softly. Yes. You just haven't had to see it. We've been lucky, sheltered. But you're almost to the age that I'll start taking you with me, okay? Adam said. Katrina nodded. Oh, okay, Dad, I understand. I should have really explained everything to you sooner. Why I focus on Nolan. Why I make you wait. I'm sorry that I didn't. And that wound on my shoulder the other day? That wasn't left by a Utah raptor like your mother said. People did it. Katrina's eyes widened, and her father nodded. Don't tell your sister, or your brother, or your mother that I told you. But I think you should know the truth. Katrina nodded. Okay, Dad, she said, hugging him. One day, Katrina, your mother and I will be old, and we won't be able to go out there or protect this place. You guys will have to. And just know that I have the fullest confidence that you can do the job and do it well. You make me proud every day, you and your brother and your sister. You are strong kids, and you will be able to handle this world and whatever it throws at you. I know it. I always have. But when this world throws something at you for the first time, you'll be scared at first. Make sure you understand that. It will scare you. Just trust me, though. I know you kids will be able to handle it when you're old enough. One day, you'll all be ready. But right now, I know, Katrina, that you're not quite old enough yet to handle just how scary things can be. As soon as you turn 13, I'll be making sure that you're going to be ready for it. As Kailani worked to clear rows in the plots for winter wheat seeds, she happened to glance around, as she did every few minutes to make sure she wasn't being watched, and paused, dropping her small garden trowel. She hadn't noticed until she had gotten close, but one of the apple trees had all its nearly ripe fruit scattered around its base, and in its trunk was a set of fresh and very deep, oozing claw marks. An entire tree's worth of fruit lost because some damn animal needed to mark that very tree for whatever reason. She groaned, thankful that none of the others were touched, but also knowing that one tree's worth of fruit could mean all the difference between eating and starvation. As Adam and Katrina continued their hug, they didn't see the silent shape in the water, the same one that had been watching Katrina, surface for a moment right next to their boat. They didn't see it glide alongside before slipping under again, the spikes on its back vanishing last, leaving barely a noticeable ripple. With a soft slosh of its armored tail just under the surface of the water, it turned and glided towards where Nolan stood at the water's edge, using kicks from its legs and swings of its tail to move closer. Maeve made her way through the trees, kicking leaves that had fallen into small piles as she went. As she neared the pack's usual sleeping area, she cupped her hands to her mouth and began calling out, "Streak! Bard! Gamma!" She listened, but didn't hear a reply. Wonder where they are, she said, looking around to make sure none of them were sneaking up on her. No sign of the raptors anywhere. She arrived at the spot the three usually slept in and found them gone, though there were plenty of footprints in the damp dirt. The pack had taught her a few basic things about tracking, and so she crouched down, looking each set of footprint over carefully and determining which ones were the freshest. She stood and followed them deeper into the woods, assuming the pack had gone to hunt breakfast. She trailed them for about a minute when she lost the tracks, and as she bent down to try to find them again, a purple snout poked out of the bush right next to her. She slowly turned to face it and made contact with the large Velociraptor. "Hey, Bard," she chuckled, slightly nervous due to his sudden appearance. He suddenly seized her leg in his hand and drug her off into the brush. Nolan had to admit he was bored. He'd gone around the whole pond twice and had not gotten a single tug on his line. He decided to try casting off the dock again, since that's where he got his bite on the line the day before, but that hadn't worked either. So, he continued looping around the bank, staying at the edge of the water, casting his line in over and over again. He was just about to reel it in again when there was a sudden, gentle but firm tug on the end. He froze, trying to pull the line out, and after a moment he found it was indeed attached to something. "Dad!" he called, his mind racing at what could possibly have taken the bait, what possibly could have been latched onto his hook, every nightmarish possibility, every terrifying animal that might have been hidden in the water, running through his mind. He began growing paranoid about the thing at the end of his line as his mind continued racing. Nolan saw his father and sister stand up on the boat, and he pointed his line into the water. He saw Adam rush to the stern of the boat, grab his gun, and return to the bow. Adam crouched down and used the safety rail to steady his aim. Katrina stood behind him, eyes wide. Nolan saw his father nod to him, and so he began to gently reel the line in, the mass seemingly allowing itself to be enticed towards the bank. The reel loudly protested each time he rolled more of it in, and it took nearly all of Nolan's strength to pull the line closer. Nolan, who was becoming more afraid and uneasy the closer the unknown thing on his line came to shore, swore he felt resistant and heavy pulls as he reeled more of the line in. Adam gazed through the scope of his .22, keeping the crosshairs aimed at exactly the spot his son's line vanished into the water. waiting to see what came up. The thing on the end suddenly seemed to put up a fight because it stopped moving, no matter how hard Nolan tugged. He reeled in more of the line, but the thing would not move. His feelings of unease and paranoia came back stronger than ever. "It's too heavy! It stopped letting me pull it!" he called, a hint of panic creeping into his voice as he looked into the water, unable to see anything. Or was there a shape out there that he could make out? A mass at the end of his line? It took a moment to be sure, but Nolan became convinced there was indeed something there. Adam could see it too. "Scoot further back, son!" he called, sliding the hammer on the gun back with his thumb. Katrina covered her ears as her father began to take aim. Nolan nodded and crouched to the ground, scooting further back from the water, still pulling on the line. Crosshairs on the center of the dark mass, Adam fired a single shot into it. The water splashed when the bullet struck it, and suddenly the mass seemed to stop resisting. Nolan stood and began reeling and pulling the thing to shore once again. His reel still protesting due to the weight, eager to see what they had caught and if it was what could have bitten the fishing rod in half. Adam stood up as well, seeing his son was having success in pulling the shape into the shallow water. With a grunt, Nolan gave a strong tug and the mass splashed to the surface. It was a tangled bundle of moss-covered tree branches. Nothing more. Nolan's hook had gotten wrapped around the soggy bundle, and it had been dragging along the bottom. Nolan groaned and saw his father had stood up. With an apologetic shrug, Nolan set his pole down and waded into the ankle-deep water to untangle his line. Adam shook his head, ejected the bullet casing off the side of the boat, and sat the gun back down. "Maybe next time," he said, loud enough for Nolan to hear. "Want to check the bait and see if anything is bitten on it at least?" Katrina asked. Adam chuckled. "Sure," he said, willing to entertain the notion. As they walked to and crouched on the bow, pulling up the hook, neither saw the spiked tail briefly surface once again off the starboard side of the boat, the 3 rows of spikes growing along the end, stabbing out of the water. A moment later it was gone into the depths again, and the only traces of it, nothing more than a small wake of ripples, sloshed against the side of the boat and were extinguished. "Is this really necessary, Bard?" Maeve asked. He was carrying her in his jaws by her hood, as if she was a troublesome hatchling. She was dangling low enough that her feet were dragging on the ground slightly behind her. Bard didn't answer, though Maeve was sure he was smirking. When he got back to where the others in his pack were gathered, he let her go and said to his fellow dinosaurs, "Look who I found, focused on only footprints and not her surroundings." "I said I was sorry," Maeve protested, scrambling to her feet before Streak could lecture her. "I just wanted to tell you guys something and didn't want to wait for you to come back. There's something real, and I mean real, weird going on at home." Gamma cocked his head to the side. "Weird? Weird how?" he asked. Streak didn't say anything, so it was clear he was giving her a chance to talk. "Well, we took a family fun day yesterday, just to spend some time together and relax. Unwind, you know. And suddenly, while I was swimming with my sister, Dad starts yelling at us to get out of the water. Something had dragged my brother's fishing rod out of his hand, bit it in half, and threw it back out of the water." "Do you know what it was?" Streak asked. Maeve shook her head and reached up to rub his nose. "No, Dad thinks it was probably a risottus, but he doesn't know. We can't swim again until he catches it, which sucks because the water won't be warm much longer." "What's a risottus?" Bard asked. "Big prehistoric fish, way older than dinosaurs, that could eat a human whole if it wanted to," Maeve explained. "Smart of your father to not let you swim then," Streak agreed, nodding in an approving manner. "What's he doing to catch it exactly?" "Baiting with my sister," Maeve said with a shrug. "He's using your sister as bait?" Bard replied quickly. Maeve laughed, realizing how it must have sounded. Oh no, she's helping him bait a hook to catch it. They're using pork from a pig. Yeah, Bard. What father would use their own child as fish bait? Gamma asked. Bard looked a little flustered at the comment. Streak even chuckled. Then he nudged Maeve. So, what's this about you not paying attention to your surroundings? Maeve looked up at the raptor. I can explain that? She said, not sounding too sure. Well, we've already eaten, so let's go back to our nesting site. There? Please do explain, Streak said. The pack returned to their nesting site with Maeve, and the dinosaurs settled down on their sleeping spots. Maeve then sat down against Streak's belly as he looked at her expectantly. Maeve said, quickly looking around in all directions for something else to talk about instead of what Streak was wanting to hear. Hey, you have really nice, sickle claws? Maeve said, spotting the large sickles on both of Streak's middle toes and stringing a quick statement together, which she made up as she said it, and knew before it was even done that it was the most pitiful distraction attempt she'd ever made. Thanks, I used them on a deer about an hour ago, and they work superbly, he said, emphasizing the last word. He sank one of the sickles into the ground for added effect, and saw Maeve gulp at the sight of it effortlessly sinking into the dirt. Having given her a bit of motivation to be truthful, he then continued, looking Maeve right in the eyes. Now, how about that explanation, Streak said, knowing she was just trying to stall and steering the topic back to the one he wanted an explanation for. Yeah, right. You see, I was trying to find you guys, and my mind was elsewhere, because I knew you keep the area clear, she said, and then she sighed. Fine, I wasn't paying attention to my surroundings. Happy? Because you were honest with me? Yes, Streak said, nuzzling Maeve on the side of her head. I'm not as cold as stone. Mistakes happen, he said. You just remember this in the future, okay? Always keep an eye on your surroundings. I definitely will, especially the next time I go swimming, Maeve giggled, wrapping her arms around Streak's neck and hugging him tightly. He chuckled and purred softly. You're a good kid, he said, looking Maeve in the eye again. The best. Your parents are lucky to have you. They think I'm hard-headed, Maeve replied. Streak nodded. Yeah, I get why. But you're also very sweet. If you were my kid, I wouldn't change anything about you. If I was your kid, I'd have wicked cool claws, Maeve replied, curling her fingers to resemble claws. He'd also have to find a mate before he can have kids. Adult male in his prime, and no female has ever so much as looked at him, Bard said, butting in with an amused, taunting tone. Streak shot his fellow a glare, accompanying it with a hiss. He looked at Maeve and said, Not a comment from you, or I may just have seconds with breakfast. Maeve laughed, nodded, and hugged him around the neck again. Streak continued to pretend he was annoyed and grumpy as she did. Kailani circled around the cabin by the time Nolan had his line untangled, and she walked over to the water's edge. Adam! She called. She saw him look her way and wave. Yeah? He called back. Something clawed up one of the apple trees. All the fruit from it is a total loss. Clawed it up, Adam replied. You sure it wasn't a deer just rubbing antlers against the side of the tree? I've seen a buck whitetail several times early in the mornings along the tree line back there. Yes, I know what deer marks look like. These were claw marks, ones that left deep, oozing gashes, Kailani loudly replied, rather annoyed. Adam raised his hands. I believe you, and yeah, that's odd. It was probably that Gajirasaurus. It could still be hanging around. I don't know. I've never heard of a rogue dinosaur clawing trees up like that. Except for maybe Therizinosaurus. They've got the claws, you know. But they would leave bigger ones higher up. If I didn't know better, I would say it was meant to scare us. Well, don't let something that's nothing go to your head. We'll keep an eye out, but the thing in the pond should be our big concern. And where's my Eve? I haven't seen her all morning, Adam shouted back in reply. Cleaning her room, Kailani replied. Willingly? No, but I told her if she didn't clean it, then we'd give it to someone who would. Can I have it? Nolan called, reeling his line in again. Kailani glared at him. You don't exactly keep your room spring cleaning worthy yourself, mister. At least mine doesn't need a bulldozer, he called back, casting the line into the water again. Maeve had been so content while snuggled with Streak that she unintentionally drifted off to sleep. She slowly stirred out of sleep, wrapped in the arms and claws of the sleeping Velociraptor who she'd been previously sitting against, snuggled up against his chest and belly. She sat up without waking Streak and glanced around, seeing the other raptors were also curled up and asleep. She then turned her gaze up to the sky. Oh, shoot! She said loudly, lifting Streak's arm off her stomach and scrambling to her feet. Streak, and the other raptors in the pack, were on theirs in seconds as well. What? Gamma asked, looking around for a threat. It's nearly lunchtime. I gotta get home before my mom realizes I'm not cleaning my room. I'll see you guys later, Maeve quickly said before sprinting off into the forest. Streak, Bard, and Gamma watched her. Gamma chuckled. She's not paying attention to her surroundings, is she? Nope. I don't think the lesson's sunk in, Streak said. Next time, I'll pretend to actually hunt her then, Bard replied with a chuckle. And our alpha won't snuggle her like a loving father instead of lecturing her, Gamma added. Streak hissed at them both, though it was not a serious one. Yeah, I wouldn't change her either, Bard agreed, knowing how Streak really felt. Streak huffed. It's just a good thing for her that we keep our area of the forest clear of threats, since she runs off on her own so much, he added, continuing to put on a stern, indifferent, and slightly annoyed face instead of an amused one despite being so, though his packmates could see right through the facade. Bard chuckled. Yeah, none of us would change her in any way, he said, to Streak with a knowing look. He knew his brother agreed despite his attempt to remain stern and annoyed with Maeve's lack of vigilance to her surroundings. Streak just huffed in response. Maeve sprinted through the forest and passed between tree trunk after tree trunk, indeed, completely unaware of her surroundings. But the swift runner made it back out of the forest safely and ran across the clearing to her bedroom window. Staying out of sight as best as she was able, with her father, brother, and sister all at the pond, all any of them would have had to have done is slightly glance over and she'd have been plainly visible thanks to her bright red jacket. But they didn't, and Maeve reached her window without being spotted. She slid open the window, crawled inside, closed it, and began throwing stuff into her closet as a knock came at the door. Maeve Wachowski, you unlock this bedroom door right now, her mother said. Just a second, Mom, she called back, arms full of a dozen pair of dirty clothes. Looking around in a panic, Maeve hurried back to her window, opened it again, dropped the clothes outside, shut the window, and ran to her bedroom door. Hey, I was just about to strip the bed, she said, as her mother barged inside. Kailani looked around the room. About as far along as I expected you'd be, you little procrastinator, she said, walking straight to the closet. As she pulled it open, a few toys, clothing items, and other basic odds, like pencils and drawings, tumbled out. Well, not as bad as I was expecting. Seems you at least didn't stuff everything in here. She closed the door. Put this stuff away in the right place, please. You have a desk, shelves, and bin for a reason. Then bring me any of your dirty clothes. I'm doing laundry this afternoon. As her mother left the room and closed the door, Maeve sighed and collapsed on the bed. I can't believe I got away with it, she sighed, looking at her window, groaning as she knew she'd have to bring all those clothes back inside now. Why did I throw them out the window? She said, covering her eyes. By the time the sun was setting, Adam sighed in defeat and pulled the rope back up. Nolan had long since given up and gone back to the house. Nothing had happened at all since he'd made his catch. Katrina watched as her father pulled the pork up, hoping for a better sign than the first time they'd checked it. The pork was untouched. The only thing that was different about it was that it was wet and dripping dirty water. Adam shook his head. All we achieved today was wasting a full meal's worth of food, he said, pulling the soggy, raw meat off the hook and tossing it back into the water. As her father began pulling the anchor back up to the surface, Katrina just watched as the pork sank back out of sight for the last time. Soon, the anchor was back on the boat, sitting on the bow next to the hook, and Adam and Katrina retrieved their paddles. Adam patted Katrina on the shoulder. Don't be discouraged. It was a good idea. Whatever's in the water just didn't cooperate, he said, sticking his paddle into the water. We'll just have to try a different approach next time. How? What are we going to do next? Katrina asked. Adam paused and looked at her. Well, the way I figure it, it's about too cold to really be swimming anymore anyway. Why not just let the winter months go by? The water will freeze, and maybe, just maybe, whatever on Earth is in the water will starve without anything to eat. And if it's not a giant fish? Well, if it's some giant amphibian or the like, the lack of food will drive it away, and next spring we can restock the pond with fish from the lake. Don't those big amphibians hibernate, though? Katrina asked. Remember that one year we saw the Kulasuchus? Yeah, Kulasuchus coming out of hibernation near the lake? They hibernate underwater. Adam sighed. We'll work it out, he said. For now, though, we'll all just stay clear of the water. If it's a fish, then it can't reach you. And even those amphibians are only dangerous in the water. They're too slow on land to be a real threat out of it. I might set one of my game cameras up and aim it at the pond, see if it captures anything that might be in there, he added. He then leaned over the side and continued paddling. We might even be to blame for the lack of fish in there, given how much we fish out of here for food without bringing any more in from time to time, he said after a moment, mostly to himself. Well, something snapped the fishing rod, Katrina replied. Adam nodded. You're right. There is something in the pond. I was just saying that it might not be what's responsible for the fish not being so plentiful. So, what's the plan for tomorrow? Katrina asked, starting to paddle as well. Well, the food stock is even in a sorrier state now. I'm going to need to go hunting again to make up for what was wasted today. And then some, Adam said. Winter is going to be a little rough, but don't worry. We'll pull through. We always do, right? Katrina nodded, smiling. Right, she affirmed. The family had a nice dinner that night. Cornbread with salted fried fish, which was actually delicious for once. And even some lemonade made with spring water and lemon juice squeezed from freshly picked ones that grew on the trees at the end of the row of the apple trees. Despite the less than productive day, everyone's moods seemed to be in good places again, and they had an actual conversation that lasted much longer into the night than dinner did. It was the first dinner table conversation the family had had in a very long time. After night fell, and after the family had long since gone to bed, the clearing the cabin resided in was dark and still, and version 2, aside from his glowing eyes, was invisible as he came out of the woods and approached the cabin. Slowly, he stalked towards the house. Minding each place, he sat his foot down, ensuring that he didn't make so much as a twig snap or leave an impression of a footprint. As he got nearer, he dropped onto all fours and crawled closer. So low, his belly all but dragged on the ground. Only when he was right up at one of the house's walls did he stand back up on two legs. Sniffing the night air, picking out where the scents of the people inside were the strongest, Version 2 slunk to one of the windows and pressed up against it, peering inside and staring at the shape on the bed. He stood still, just staring, waiting to see how long it took for the person in the bedroom's instincts to take over, knowing that they were being watched, and wake them up. Still staring, unblinking, Version 2 raised his hands to the glass, and he slowly began to trace his claws down along it. He continued to keep his gaze unbroken, looking the small shape tucked into its bed over, picking up on every detail he could see. From the size of the shape on the bed, he gathered that it was likely the youngest of the children. One of the two he had swum underneath while they were swimming, enjoying their complete unawareness that he was so close. If he had wanted, he could have sunk his teeth into their legs and pulled them down into the water, drowning them on the murky bottom. But he hadn't. He wanted to enjoy the thrill it brought to his crazed, feral mind of his prey being unaware of his presence. What also brought on an intoxicating thrill was the plans he was creating for the different fate that would befall each of the family members, such as the one he had in mind for the certain individual he was staring at. "He'll fit nice and snugly in my starved belly," Version 2 thought, lustfully and sadistically, staring at the sleeping human in her bed with drool falling from his maw, still tracing his claws down the glass, careful to make sure he didn't leave any marks on the surface. He didn't want to reveal his presence to everyone just yet. For now, he just wanted to scare one of the family members by letting them glimpse him. Before killing them, he would let a few of them catch small glimpses of him, enough to make them uneasy, tense, and afraid. Then, when he had had his fun of that, he would move in for the kill, for the collective slaughter. No one in the house knew that their fates were already being set in stone, that each one of them was being planned to die differently from the other. Each one would endure a different build-up prior to meeting a different end by his claws and teeth, Version 2 thought. Each one would experience a different variation of terror prior to death. Preferably, Version 2 was hoping he could kill them in ways that exploited the weaknesses he had picked up in each of them. Maeve stirred and opened her eyes, confused as to why she had woken up. She normally slept all night without any issues, even in bad weather, so this was unusual. She didn't have to go to the bathroom or need a drink, so Maeve didn't understand what had woken her up. She rolled over, facing her bedroom wall, looking at one spot that was illuminated by what little moonlight was out that night. The light was coming in through her window, illuminating part of her dresser, and a picture frame on her wall that housed a night vision game camera picture. It was one she really liked, showing a Carnotaurus, Maeve's favorite dinosaur, walking past the camera in full view. She looked at the picture and noticed that something about how the light in the room looked was off. As her tired brain registered it, it picked up on something else. The fact that something felt wrong. She couldn't place it, but something wasn't right. A detail was amiss, and her subconscious was screaming at her to notice it as well. Maeve lifted her head up, looking at the odd shape plastered on her wall in the dim moonlight. Something about it wasn't right. It didn't look like any other normal nighttime shadow. She focused on the spot, and she swore it moved. She swore that she saw large teeth inside a slowly opening set of jaws, cast as a shadow on her dresser and wall. Maeve sat up fully and spun to face her window. She saw a shape standing there, its wide, glowing yellow eyes looking right at her, two large hands, each with four clawed fingers pressed against the glass, long, quill-like spikes growing out of the back of its skull. She'd seen plenty of dinosaurs over the year, but that was no dinosaur standing at her window. That thing outside the house was a monster. Maeve screamed and covered her head with a blanket as the shape outside moved back from the window and took off. She kept screaming even as footsteps ran down the hall and into her room. She sat up when the door opened, crying, watching her mother and father rush to her side, Katrina and Nolan also appearing in the doorway. "Maeve, what is it?" Kailani asked, sitting down on her bed and hugging her daughter tightly. The, the window. I don't know what, but there was something horrible outside of it, Maeve sobbed, burying her face in her mother's chest. Kailani hugged her sobbing child and looked at Adam, who hurried to the window and looked outside, seeing nothing at all in the clearing. He looked at his wife and shook his head. Kailani nodded and made Maeve look up at her. "Are you sure it wasn't a bad dream?" she asked. "Yes! I wasn't dreaming!" Maeve screamed. Kailani sighed and wiped the tears off of her daughter's face. "Okay, what did it look like?" she asked. I don't know. I only saw its shadow. It had spikes on its head and big teeth that looked like they didn't fit it in its mouth and giant claws on its hands," Maeve sobbed. Katrina and Nolan looked at each other, confusion on their faces. "Honey, you've got to give us more than that," Kailani said. "You believe me, right?" Maeve asked. "Honey, what you're describing just sounds too horrific to be real. There's no animal that looks like what you're saying," Kailani slowly replied. "You sound like you're describing a monster." Adam walked over and sat on the bed, and sat down next to his youngest daughter. "Sweetie, are you sure it wasn't just some dinosaur or even a deer passing? Maybe something you see all the time that just looked weird in the dim light?" "It was big! It took up nearly the entire window. It had these big teeth." "What kind of teeth?" Adam asked, briefly remembering for the first time in days the weird ones in the mouth of the dinosaur that had crawled out of the lake. He wasn't sure why that moment popped in his mind right then. Maybe it was from Maeve's choice of words. Though now that he realized a part of it did seem familiar to him suddenly. He couldn't place it, though. It was on the edge of his mind, but his brain just couldn't remember the needed connection between the way its teeth were arranged and the drawing of the Adestus teeth from his book. The possibility of one of the same species as the mysterious one having been in the pond was something that had never even crossed his mind either, and he didn't even think that there were any others around, let alone one of the same species being right outside his house. As Maeve began talking again, Adam completely forgot about the dead dinosaur that he'd left by the lakeside, and the teeth that seemed so familiar. I don't know. Normal dinosaur teeth," Maeve said. Adam nodded. "Well, whatever it was, it's gone, honey. It was probably just something curious. If it was aggressive, I don't think it would have run off. Just try to get back to sleep, okay?" he said, kissing her on the head. "You don't believe me," Maeve said. "No, we do, honey. It's just, it was dark. And what you're describing sounds too disturbing to actually have been there. You probably just saw a passing animal and your mind played tricks on you. Animals look weird in the dark. Like your dad pointed out, it happens," Kailani assured. "I've seen many things in the dark that look terrifying, only for them to just be normal objects in daylight." "I knew you didn't," Maeve said, yanking her blankets out of her mother's hands and covering her head. "Go away." Kailani started to open her mouth, but Adam placed his right hand on her arm, shaking his head. She sighed, but nodded, standing up and walking out of the door, silently ushering her other kids out and sending them back to their respective beds. Adam followed her and stopped at the door. "Honey, we believe you. Whatever is out there, it's gone. You're safe here inside the house. And like your mother said, I'm sure it really isn't as scary looking as it seems. You just saw its silhouette after all." When he didn't get an answer, Adam just sighed and pulled the door closed. Maeve stayed hidden under her blankets and sobbed long into the night, unable to even cry herself back to sleep. Though he didn't think it was a necessary action, Adam had seen that whatever had been at the window deeply affected his daughter. So, he sat in the living room for several hours after that, watching through the windows and waiting to see if Maeve's visitor came back. He hoped he could assure her of what the creature had been in the morning, but nothing did. In fact, nothing even entered the clearing for the rest of the night. Not even a stray raccoon. And when the night got old, Adam finally went back to bed. And by the time he did, he was convinced that it had indeed been nothing to worry about. To be continued. Followed, an original post-apocalyptic story from version 2, read by the author. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed. That marks the second of Wave 3's narrations being out, and this was definitely a longer one than the last one. But I hope you enjoyed. I love making these, and this will probably be the last one featuring the Wachowskis, because I don't want to give the whole story away, so if you want to see how this all ends, you're going to have to wait for the book to come out. Hopefully, sometime in 2023, it will come out. I do feel pretty confident that it will come out in 2023. I really thought it was going to come out this year, but some real-life stuff happened back in the summer that basically caused everything to get delayed by like 12 months. So I'm hoping that, yeah, I just hope it'll come out in 2023. I really hope, and I think it will, but I'm not going to give a specific date just in case I'm proven a liar. But anyway, I do hope you enjoyed. I've done a bunch of these, and if you want to listen to some more of them, listen to the rest of the Survivor's Daily Routine trilogy, which this was kind of like an epilogue to set the main plot of the book up, because that trilogy basically was read from the setup portion of the book, and then this is from the main plot section. So there's those. There's more from, and then all the other ones are from the first book. And they kind of form a narration anthology where each one is set at different points and follows different characters. So I put a lot of work into these, and they're really fun to do. So if you're at all curious, please go give them a listen. Thank you for listening to this one. And if you're at all curious to learn more about the books or see when they're published, please stick around. And I don't just make audio narration content, so check out what else I do. I do a lot of different types of videos, so you might find other stuff you are into here. So thank you for watching once again, and I will see you in the next one.